Let's just yeah. Okay. All right. Morning. So, Parsha Toldos. So, Toldos literally means generations. Perhaps more contextually, it would refer to offspring. So I'm going to write down this pasuk from the parsha and we're going to talk about it. So it starts off, Ve'ela. Whatever it'll do, Toldos. Yitzchak ben Avraham, which means, and these were the generations or the offspring of Yitzchak, the son of Avraham, comma, and then it continues, Avraham, Holid, es Yitzchak. Avraham fathered Yitzchak. Now, obviously, we're going to have to address the elephant on the whiteboard, which is that there is a very clearly redundant set of words up there. If Yitzchak is ben Avraham, if Yitzchak is the son of Avraham, then that means that Avraham fathered Yitzchak. So why does it need to say it twice? It could just say, Ve'ela Toldos Yitzchak, comma, these are the offspring of Yitzchak. And where did Yitzchak come from? Who was his father? Avraham Holid es Yitzchak. Or say, Ve'ela Toldos Yitzchak ben Avraham, period, end of sentence. Why does it need to say, these are the offspring of Yitzchak, the son of Avraham? Avraham fathered Yitzchak. That's one of the suggestions, correct, one of the explanations. So one of the reasons is that, Avram and Sarah had been married for a long time without children. And then right before this whole story happened, when Yitzchak was born, Sarah was taken by Avimelech, by this king, and lived with him. And the Torah told us that he didn't touch her, but, we know that. Number one, we know that because the Torah tells us. Number two, we believe it. But a lot of people didn't believe it. And to be perfectly honest, it's not an unreasonable suspicion that if there's a couple that's been married for decades and didn't have any kids whilst they were married together, and then the wife was living with another man for a little, and then all of a sudden she got pregnant and had a baby, you could see why people would be saying things and thinking things like, it's not unreasonable, to be honest. Just not taking into account the character of the people we're talking about, etc. But, for people who are not looking at that part of the picture, there's a reason why people were saying it. So the Torah is telling us, it's reinforcing, it's emphasizing. Eila Toldos Yitzchak ben Avram. These are the generations of Yitzchak, the son of Avram. And just before you come and start making smart aleck suggestions, the Torah tells us, by the way, Avram Holid es Yitzchak. Yes, Avram was the father of Yitzchak, and this was clarified when Yitzchak was born and grew up, and he actually looked very, very much like Avraham. So Hashem ensured that the resemblance between Avram and Yitzchak would be unmistakable. So while Sarah was pregnant, maybe when Yitzchak was a newborn baby, people were saying things, but it quickly became very clear that Yitzchak was Avram's son and not Avimelech's son. So the pasuk is alluding to that and telling us this is the offspring of Yitzchak, the son of Avraham. And by the way, yes, Avraham fathered Yitzchak, not Avimelech, and it was very clear and it became very obvious and plain to see due to the very strong resemblance between Avraham and Yitzchak. So that's one answer. We're going to have 4 different explanations or responses to this redundancy in the pasuk. So number 1 is that repetition or that additional phrase that doesn't seem to be necessary is coming to point out something very specific and very important. So that's number 1. Then number 2 is the second explanation is that these 2 phrases, Yitzchak ben Avraham, Yitzchak the son of Avraham, and Avraham fathered Yitzchak, both give us the same information, that information being Avram was Yitzchak's father, Yitzchak was Avram's son, but the direction is opposite. So the first is telling us in the context of Yitzchak. Who was Yitzchak? Yitzchak was the son of Avram. The second part of the pasuk is talking from the perspective of Avraham. Avraham fathered Yitzchak. So the context is different. The primary person we're talking about in the first part is Yitzchak, who incidentally was the son of Avraham. The primary person we're focusing on here is Avraham, who fathered Yitzchak. And so what this alludes to here is the fact that is the idea that who was whose claim to fame. You know, people like to name drop and have a claim to fame. Oh, I know this person's my cousin, I worked with this person, you know, but people have all interesting kinds of ways that they evaluate who's worth, you know, having as a claim to fame. But it's not an uncommon thing. Or, you know, it could even be more simple than that. You meet someone meets you, and they're like, oh, yeah, I know this person. I know your father. I know your cousin, you know. So what happened here was this claim to fame that the Pasuk's telling us that Yitzchak and Avram each claimed each other as their claim to fame. So who is Yitzchak? If you would ask Yitzchak, who is he? He's like, oh, I'm Yitzchak, the son of Avraham. Avram is my claim to fame. He's my father. Do you know who my father is? My father's Avram. So Yitzchak, the son of Avraham. And Avraham did the same thing in the opposite direction. If you want to ask Avraham, you know, if someone would meet Avraham, he'd be like, oh, I'm Yitzchak's father. Avram, Helidas Yitzchak. Avram is Yitzchak's father. You know, and Avram was proud and took pride in the fact that he was Yitzchak's father. So Yitzchak took pride in being Abraham's son. Avram took pride in being Yitzchak's father. So that's what the Pasuk is telling us. The Pasuk is letting us know that there was this sort of bi-directional pride taking going on, that each one had nachas from the other one and took pride in being, you know, in this relationship with the other, whether as a father or a son. So again, we already see now that the second phrase is not redundant. Each one of these 2 phrases that we would have thought we'd need either or, but not both, we do actually have, there is a reason why both of them are there, and they're both coming to tell us something different. Now we're going to go for the next 2. We're going to do a total of 4 explanations here. And depending on how it goes, we may talk about common themes between the 4. We may or may not. We'll see how it goes. So for the next 2, we're going to go a little deeper, a little less literal. So for the third one, the third explanation is going to address the characteristics and the primary character traits that Avram and Yitzchak were known for. So generally in Hasidus, in Kabbalah and mystical Judaism, there's a lot of talk about midos, about character attributes. Sometimes it's translated as emotions. It's not a great translation, but I don't know of a better one. Character attributes might be good, but that doesn't separate the midos from the seichel, from the chachma bin hadas. Sorry? Measure is a literal translation of midos, but when we talk about in spheros or in the nefesh, the kochas hanefesh, there's chachma bin hadas, which we call seichel, and then there's chesed gvur tiferes netzach yisod malchus that we call midos. So there are good translations, but I don't know of a really good word that translates them in a way that makes sense in this context specifically. Maybe we'll get one day. If anybody knows of one, please let me know, because I'm looking for one.
Is it more about the feelings?
It is kind of, but it's not quite feelings. It's not quite. It's deeper than feelings. It's the character traits that make us who we are.
Attitude.
But it's the, sorry?
Attitude.
It's the things that are behind the scenes of our attitude. I would say that the attitude is maybe an outcome of our midos. It's not what our midos are. So in the midos, the first two, and these are the two that get the most attention, are chesed and gvura. Chesed is kindness, gvura is strength. Now, they are, in a sense, opposites, but they're only opposites if we really understand what they mean and what's going on. Because if you would ask someone what's the opposite of being kind, what would you say is the opposite of kindness? Sorry? Being mean, exactly. And gvura doesn't mean being mean. Right? Gvura is a midah of Hashem. Hashem is not mean, ever. So gvura doesn't mean mean. We say that Shammai was gvura and Hillel was chesed. Shammai wasn't a mean person. Right? He was dedicated, he was caring. Gvura literally means strength. Now, let's take a step back and think about this in terms of themes. There is chesed. Let's think of chesed as being open and giving, which generally would be kindness. But the opposite of openly giving isn't being mean, but it is restricting, right? The opposite of being openly giving is calculating and restricting and restraining, constraining, holding back. And that's what gvura is. Gvura is about measuring, restricting, and perhaps being demanding. Now let's think of Hillel and Shammai as teachers, right? They were both master teachers. If we would think of a chesed approach to teaching and a gvura approach to teaching, when we say that someone is a chesed style teacher, it doesn't mean that they're very kind to their students. That's not what it means, because the gvura style teacher could be kind too. It's talking about the approach in the teaching itself. And a chesed teacher is someone that's openly giving. A student asks a question, you give an answer. And this attribute of chesed is associated with Avraham. Right, Avram was known to be someone who was kind. He was always giving. But what being giving is really about, it's not about the kindness. Kindness is how we perceive someone who's openly giving. When you see someone who's openly giving, you think, oh, wow, that's a kind person. So Avram was openly giving. If you came to Avram and you were thirsty, he would say, here's a cup of water. Shammai, or a teacher who is associated with gvura, with strength, when you come to them with a question, they don't just give you the answer, right? Avram is chesed. You come to Avram, you're thirsty, he gives you some water. You come to a teacher who's chesed, and you say, I have a question, they give you an answer. A gvura teacher, someone like Shammai, would be a demanding teacher. You come with a question, and the teacher will say, okay, that's a good question. Where do you think you might be able to look to get some more direction that's going to bring you closer to the answer? And what questions do you think that you need to answer in order to figure out what's going on and to bring you closer? So the gvura teacher is being strong. They're measuring. They're not just giving you everything. They're holding back in terms of what they give you. The flip side of that is they're being demanding. They're demanding that you bring out what you have inside. Right now, this teacher's not being mean. They're not being nasty. In some ways, they may be doing you more of a favor than the chesed teacher is, to an extent, because you're going to develop the skills of research and learning and figuring things out, which you're not going to get from the chesed teacher. Right? So imagine you have 12 months in 2 classes and 1 class has each style teacher. After 12 months or 9 months of an academic year of learning under the chesed style teacher, you'll come out with an encyclopedia in your head. You'll have tons of information because they're teaching, giving answers. You'll come out with tons of answers and information in your head. That's chesed. The gvura teacher, you're going to come out at the end of the year and you won't have covered much material. But everything that you learned, you'll really understand because you struggled and you figured it out and you did the research and you got the answers for yourself. So you'll have a much smaller amount of information, but you'll have a much deeper connection to it. And you'll have a much more highly developed set of skills because the teacher was demanding. Right? So gvura isn't being mean because it's the opposite of chesed. It's not the opposite of kindness. It's the opposite of being openly giving, which also happens to be kind, generally associated with kindness. So gvura doesn't mean being mean. It means being calculated, measured, demanding, strict. Now, so Avram generally, this is something that's throughout mysticism, throughout Kabbalah, throughout Chassidus. Avram is associated with Chesed. Yitzchak is associated with Gvura. So Avram's association with Chesed is very clear, right? Avram fed people. He gave people to drink. He took care of people. His tent was open on all sides. Avram was a very kind, giving person, and he wanted to just give to everybody. That was Avram. So that's Chesed. The place where you actually see in the written Torah, in the story, in the Chumash, the association between Yitzchak and Gvura is quite obscure. It's very obscure, actually. And this is that you'll see, anytime you see the association between Yitzchak and Gvura, you'll see mention of Chfiras HaBa'eres. Yitzchak dug wells. I have the story of Yitzchak, he dug wells. It's not even such a huge part of the story. It's a couple of psukim about these wells that Yitzchak dug. But it epitomizes the difference in the approach between Yitzchak and Avram. You came to Avram, you wanted water. Avram said, here's some water. He would pour you a cup of water from a pitcher and you had your water. That's chesed, giving. You come to Yitzchak and you say, I want water. I'm thirsty. He'll say, okay, great. There's a lot of water in the ground. Here's a shovel, dig. When you dig deep enough and you hit the water table, you'll have an endless supply of water. You're not just going to have the water that you have in your cup because I poured it for you, right? When Avram pours you water in a cup, you drink the water, you're done. Maybe he pours you another cup and another cup, but when he stops pouring, you're out of water, right? And when you learn from a teacher who gives you information, when they're not there to give you the answer to your question, you have a question, you don't know what to do with it. Yitzchak was gvura, strength, measured, calculated, demanding. You thirsty? Here's a shovel, go dig. And you know what happens when Yitzchak leaves? You still have a well and you still have water to drink until the well dries out. And it's the same thing with a teacher, with Hillel and Shammai. If you have a teacher who says that's a good question, now where do you think you might be able to look to figure that out? Oh, you didn't find the answer there? Why do you think that might be? Where else could you look? Oh, you got some information. Okay, now what could you do with that information to see if you can figure out your answer? You're going to come out at the end of the year without a whole lot of answers, but you're going to know that when you have a question, you now know how to get the answer for yourself. Right? So Gvura, strength, Shammai, Yitzchak, it's not being mean. Gvura does not mean being mean. It means calculated, measured, strength, demanding, which in some ways, at some times, can be more kind than chesed, than being openly giving. So when we talk about Yitzchak being associated with Gvura, this is it's going to be related to a reference in the actual Chumash, the reference in the Chumash, or the way in which the origin of this concept in the Chumash is Yitzchak digging wells, which is a Gvura approach to water. It's doing the work to extract that which is already there. It's measuring and calculating. I'm not just going to give, I'm just going to give water. There's water available. Go dig and get it out. You know what happens? You'll have a life supply left when you do that available. So this is Chesed and Gvura. Now, sure.
What was Sarah's? Yeah.
It's a good question. There's not a whole lot of discussion. Based on what we talked about last week about Avram and Sarah being partners, and we talked about this idea of sorry?
Like Avram would have had like all the souls become theirs, and then Sarah had to like.
Maybe. I don't know that it's necessarily as segregated as that. But either way, last week we talked about, we had some texts from Sarah and some texts from Avram, and we sort of put it all together to get the picture, because ultimately at the end of the day, they were a couple and they were partners. So I think it's fair to say that they were partners in this role as well.
So it would have been interesting in the chart to see like these two lead together, the birth of this one, when we get
Yeah.
the balance.
I think we learned that Sarah was chesed, but like limited chesed. She was like keeping Avram like
Gvura Sheba Chesed, maybe. Keeping him under control. Okay, good. Thank you. So, Okay. Oh, so now when we talk about Chesed and Gvura, we're going to talk about a second part of this. And let's think now of Chesed and Gvura a little bit less tightly, a little bit more loosely, in terms of a theme, of a general personality theme, perhaps. I don't know if that's quite the right way to word it, but there is, in Chassidus, there's also talk about one is the internal and one's the external. Chesed is also associated with ahava, with love. And Gvura is associated with yira, with fear or awe. Now, if we think about them as being open versus closed or calculated or measured, perhaps we can start to see the connection between ava, love, which is an open connection, which is associated with chesed, and awe, awe, or fear associated with gvura. It's more closed, it's more tight. And the truth is that they're not just associated. Really, the way that it works is that ahava is what's called the pnimius of chesed. It's the inside, it's the soul, the driving force behind the chesed. Kindness comes from a feeling of connection and love, wanting to give. And gvura, measurement, comes from yira, from awe, from this sort of more closed side of the personality. So when we talk about chesed and gvura in terms of our relationship with Hashem on a daily basis, we're going to now focus more on the ahava and the yira, the love for Hashem, and the fear or awe of Hashem. Again, awe is A-W-E, not O-R. Awe, which is a little bit different to fear. And we're going to talk about both of them because it's going to be important. Avraham, who is chesed, is associated with ahava. And Yitzchak is associated with yira. Pachad Yitzchak, Avram Oyavi. So we see a number of places in the Chumash, the description of Avraham being associated with love for Hashem, and Yitzchak being associated with awe or fear of Hashem. Now, that's not to say that it's either or or. And that's kind of the direction that we're going in now with this pasuk. So when it comes to Avas Hashem, to loving Hashem, and Yiras Hashem, literally generally translated as fear of Hashem, fear of heaven, Yir Shamayim, there are going to be a number of layers or stages or levels in terms of our disposition towards Hashem and our feelings about Hashem, our love and fear of Hashem. Now, there's going to be the more sort of basic, maybe we could call it primitive aspect in our love and fear of Hashem. It's going to be less mature. And ultimately what that boils down to is our love for Hashem is we love Hashem for the things that we get from him. And now this doesn't have to be like super primitive, like, for a first grade kid. It could be quite advanced in terms of our appreciation for spirituality and our appreciation for the value of Hashem and the fact that through our Torah and our mitzvahs, we deepen our connection to Hashem and we become closer to Hashem. All of that ultimately is still our interest in what we have to benefit from Hashem. Right? And there could be so many different manifestations of this or different variations of this. For it may be that we love Hashem and we appreciate the fact that Hashem keeps us safe and gives us food. Appreciate, and it can develop and become quite advanced in terms of its appreciation for spirituality and divinity, but ultimately the bottom line is it's all about us and what we stand to gain. And Yiras Hashem, fear of Hashem at the more basic level, and the terminology for this that's often used is Yira Tata, means the lower level of Yira, And when we talk about ava, generally the term that's used is ava zuta in Aramaic, means small love or lower love. So we have the lower level of fear of love for Hashem is love for that which we stand to get from Hashem. And the lower category or more primitive or basic category of fear of Hashem is fear of what we stand to lose. And again, that could be very basic, and it could be like, well, if I do an avera or I don't do a mitzvah, if I do a sin, Hashem's going to punish me and make something bad happen to me, which honestly, to be fair and credit where it's due, for someone to really go through their life that way already means they have a pretty substantial degree of realness in terms of their belief in Hashem, to the point that they're actually scared that bad things are going to happen. So this is not a bad thing, it's a very good thing. Then it can be a little bit more developed, a little bit more advanced, where the person is afraid of losing their connection to Hashem. And, when a person does an avera, a person, does a sin, a person doesn't do a mitzvah, they are aware of the fact that the outcome of that is that their connection to Hashem gets reduced, at least in some aspects of it. And then the person's afraid of that. So that would be, again, a more advanced and sophisticated and spiritually developed fear of Hashem, but still within this lower category, because ultimately it's still about what I stand to lose. It's fear of losing something, whether it's fear of losing, basic physical things in terms as a punishment from Hashem, whether it's fear of losing out the extent of the connection to Hashem, which again is all things considered, a pretty advanced position to be in. We're not saying that this first category of love and fear of Hashem, we're not saying that they're simple or insignificant or not good or childish or anything of the sort. The things that can be included in these categories can be quite advanced. It could include our love for Hashem, meaning the driving force between doing our mitzvahs, etc., is that we want to connect to Hashem, which is a pretty good place to be at. To be honest, for the driving force in someone's life to be that they want to strengthen and deepen their connection to Hashem is a really special place to be, and that's amazing. That being said, it's still about what Hashem has to offer the person. I want to be connected to Hashem. I want to be a part of infinity. I want to be more connected to divinity. It's still about the person. And the same is true when the driving force in someone, staying away from negative things is being afraid of losing or weakening their connection to Hashem. It's a very, it's an amazing place to be at, and if all of us were holding there and were at that state in our personal development, the world would be a lot more openly amazing than it is. The amazingness of the world would be more readily apparent, let's say, than it is. But again, it's still the same thing. Even if I measure and be careful about what I do because I don't want to risk weakening my connection with Hashem, it's amazing. It's an amazing place to be, an amazing motivation to have. That being said, it's still about me. It's not about Hashem. So this lower category of ava and yira, of love and fear, are the thing that defines them as being in the lower category is the fact that ultimately it's about the person who has the love and the fear. And the higher category, it's called ava rabba, the great love, and yira ilah, the higher level of yira, the higher fear. Here, we're going to switch the translation of yira from fear to awe, A-W-E. And what this means is, just imagine, not everybody is necessarily lucky to have someone in, like this necessarily in their life in a personal way. But if there's someone who who you look up to and you respect to such a degree that, your mood changes, you become more serious when they walk in. Why? Because you are in awe of the person. That's what the higher level of fear of Hashem is, yira ilah. It's not afraid of consequences. It's not fear. It's awe. It's being in awe of the greatness of Hashem. And what this means is, and the way that this works is when we develop our understanding and appreciation for what Hashem is sufficiently, we get to a point where we can get to a point where we are in awe of Hashem. And the reason that we are so afraid of doing something wrong is not because of the punishment, or not because of we're going to lose out, and not even that we're going to lose out or weaken our connection to Hashem. It's just like, whoa, I'm in Hashem's presence. How could I possibly do something bad?